Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anne Verghese, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of the Institute of Chinese Studies, I extend a warm welcome to all to today's book discussion on Decoding China, Hard Perspectives from India. China's rise as one of the most consequential developments of the past 4 decades has often drawn scholarly scrutiny. This volume, edited by Ambassador Kantha, brings together perspectives of 21 experienced scholars, diplomats, and military officials, providing a grounded and multifaceted assessment of China's trajectory under Xi Jinping. The discussion will engage with the wide-ranging themes and analytical perspectives contributed in the volume by our panelists, in an attempt to shed light on China's internal transformations as well as external behavior. The panelists for today's discussion are Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade, Mr. Santosh Pai, and Mr. Ananth Krishnan. Ambassador Anil Trigunayat is a former career diplomat with over 3 decades of experience, having represented India across Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, including Russia and the United States. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Vivekananda International Foundation and the United Services Institution of India. Mr. Jayadeva Ranade is president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy and former member of the National Security Advisory Board. He's associated with leading think tanks, including Center of Air Power Studies and Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. Mr. Santosh Pai is a dual qualified cross-border lawyer offering legal services to clients within the India-China corridor. He's currently a partner at Denton Slink Legal, an Indian law firm. He's treasurer and member of the governing council at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Mr. Ananth Krishnan is director and China correspondent for the Hindu Group. He's an Asia Global Fellow at the University of Hong Kong and a former visiting fellow at Brookings India. The moderator for today's discussion is Ambassador Ashok K. Kantha. He is a former career diplomat who served as Secretary East in the Ministry of External Affairs and Ambassador and High Commissioner to China, Sri Lanka, and Malaysia. He is presently Subhash Chandra Bose Chair, Professor of International Relations at Chanakya University, Bangalore, and a Distinguished Fellow at Vivekananda International Foundation, New Delhi. He is also Honorary Fellow and former Director of the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Before I hand over to the moderator, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the discussion. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the moderator. Over to you, Ambassador Kantha.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for that introduction. Let me begin by thanking Dr. Alkacharya and Team ICS for organizing this discussion on this book, which came out in August last year. Let me very briefly introduce the book and why we decided to undertake this project. There are so many books on China, but we felt that even at this point of time, there is a dearth of books which take a look at various dimensions of a phenomenon called China from different perspectives. We have books written by Western scholars, which are no doubt of great help to us. But there are two problems. One, they look at China from a perspective which is very different from ours. And secondly, despite all resources they command, we have seen how often Western scholars and Western foreign policy establishment has got China wrong. They thought that China will become like us, quote unquote, when started opening up, economically. They thought that will be followed by political liberalization. That didn't happen. Many of them started also writing off China with this concept of peak China, stagnation syndrome. And there was a surprise at Xi Jinping's ideological, assertion. Honestly, none of this came as a surprise to those of us in India who were watching the China space, whether as practitioners or as scholars. So we thought there must be, a homegrown framework for looking at China, the rise of China, its achievements, its deep anxieties, its quest to reclaim what it regards its rightful role as a leading nation in the world, because all that adds up to possibly the most consequential geopolitical development in the last 40 years. And I have no doubt that today, as also in foreseeable future, China will remain a primary strategic challenge. So the way we structured this book, there are four thematic clusters. I will not name all 21, contributors. Suffice would be to say that they are, in a way, who's who of China watching community, whether as practitioners or practitioner scholars or as academics and journalists. So we have a big picture where Dr. Arvind Gupta and I contributed, and there are essays in a bucket called China's strategic ambitions. Third is China's domestic preoccupations, and finally we have a cluster of essays focusing on China's military universe. While doing this, we were very clear that we'll do so through multidisciplinary lenses. Chapters will be by and large policy oriented with actionable recommendations wherever possible, and they must be evidence based, thematically cohesive, and strategically relevant, not only for policymakers, for defense planners, but also for lay readers. Let me now turn to my chapter, which is India's China Challenge, very briefly. The whole objective of this chapter, where I had the advantage that it was the last chapter to be written. So, in fact, I completed it only in March last year, just a few months before the book came out, was published by Bloomsbury, India. So it sought to give a kind of overall picture. That's why we call that section the big picture. I will not go into details of the chapter, which is 70 pages long. I will just, pick up three issues to illustrate points I'm making there. One, something I've already referred to, this perception that this narrative fashionable in Western circles that China has peaked because of economic slowdown, middle income trap, debt, aging population, geopolitical pushback. You had this essay by Al Brands and Michael Bickley in Foreign Affairs, which captured this perspective that China is tracing, quote unquote, a dizzying rise followed by the specter of a hard fall. I have argued forcefully that we should not fall in this kind of trap of looking at China, because China story is not over yet. It has a lot of growth stimuli left, a variety of reasons. Xi Jinping's innovation-led growth strategy, in fact, has made very significant achievements, with China being now, by any reckoning, the leading, innovation country along with the USA. Then the way it has captured advanced manufacturing space, not only green energy, where it's the dominant player, but whole lot of other areas. And export dominance. Last year, as you're aware, China was subjected to stringent sanctions by Trump, until he sort of backed out, because China deployed its own leverage through earth magnets. Still, despite tariffs in excess of 50% imposed by USA, China had a record trade surplus of $1.2 trillion. Likewise, in military domain, I don't see any sign of peaking. In fact, in many critical areas, China is catching up with the USA. In some areas, in fact, it has pushed ahead of USA. Second point I wanted to make is China as a great power is going to be very different compared to the USA. And if you look at China's role and behavior in the current Iran war, in fact, that comes across very clearly. Anil might be talking about it in his presentation. It might be a power in a hurry because it knows that some of its liabilities are catching up with it, including aging population. Also fact that you can't maintain a growth rate of double-digit growth rate for so long. So growth rate is bound to slow down. Very deliberately, it hasn't opted for alliance system. So it doesn't have a single ally. North Korea, it has a treaty relationship, but one can't really call either North Korea or Pakistan an ally in a traditional sense. Very deliberately, it has kept away from the business of providing security guarantee, unlike the USA, which provides even its, nuclear umbrella through extended deterrence. China is both status quoist and revisionist power simultaneously. It's no longer an exporter of ideology. China is in some way a particularly selfish major power. It's focusing narrowly on its national interest. It provides global public goods, but it doesn't want to be security anchor of the world, unlike the USA. So looking ahead, uh, China is likely to expand its footprint, diplomatic, economic, commercial, technological, and even military. But it's not likely to replace the USA as the superpower the way USA has, behaved over last 3 decades or so. My final point, very briefly, is about the future of India-China relations. Elsewhere, including a book which Ananth Krishnan brought out, I had argued that there are four possible scenarios: future of India-China relations, protracted competition and armed coexistence. That's where we are today, and which is the most likely scenario. But there's a scenario which is a little more optimistic and possibly feasible. And that's what, to my mind, we should be pursuing. That is managed rivalry, competition, but yet, constantly looking for opportunity for cooperation and a modicum of normalization. Third is unlikely. That is China, sort of providing strategic accommodation vis-a-vis India. And fourth is one we must avoid very carefully. That is heightened confrontation and conflict. So I'll conclude by saying that India must simultaneously avoid two symmetrical traps. The first is the trap of naive accumulation, seeking a reset that China's current strategic calculus makes unlikely, allowing the lure of a warmer atmosphere to soften positions on the border, boundary talks, or economic de-risking. The second is the trap of reflexive confrontation, allowing the scale of the China challenge to dominate India's entire strategic horizon, drain out the developmental agenda on which India's long-term power ultimately rests. Between two traps lies the difficult, unglamorous, and essential work of managed competition, while continuously exploring viable options for cooperation, building capabilities steadily, engaging diplomatically with realism, and maintaining the strategic patience that the long arc of relationship with China demands. I'll stop here. Uh, let's now move on to our other, panelists. I will start with Mr. Anil Trigunayat. Anil has contributed very insightful and I may say very topical chapter in the book, considering issues that are keeping us preoccupied these days. That is China and West Asia, a solid trajectory. He has argued that China has emerged as the most consequential external actor in West Asia through a strategy of geoeconomic engagement, uh, political value neutrality, and quiet institution building, and that it's moving inexorably towards becoming a US plus one power in the region, though full full scale displacement of the USA by China remains an unlikely or distant possibility. Anil, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you to the ICS and Professor Gacharya for inviting me. And it was indeed an honor and privilege to be a part of the book project, sir, that you um, have brought out. And I think personally, I feel that this is perhaps one of the best references in one place as far as the China, various engagements of China globally and impact on us are concerned. So you are absolutely right that I have argued that China wants to be the next US in the Middle East or West Asia, as we call it, but is still not there. Nor does it want to replace United States at this stage to be the security provider or guaranteeing some kind of a security umbrella. But it is also heading slowly, gradually in that direction. One of the things it has done is it has focused more on geoeconomics, and that has become its driving factor in the region. So, as such, it is the biggest player in terms of its reach. If you come to think of it, all the members in the region are the BRI partners from Tehran to Tel Aviv. And they have been part of this thing. Last one was actually Syria under Assad, but it continues to play a very important role. Um, Another thing that is very important is that China has been able to plow its other initiatives like the Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, GCI, and now the Global Governance Initiatives, which are very much there. So while it is continuing to remain under the radar, it has become a consequential player there. It has also very assiduously tried to encash on the sentiment, somewhat anti-US sentiment, because most of the countries in the region had become disenchanted by the United States and its policies in the region. They thought that they are simply the clients now, and the United States' only concern remains the security of Israel, and which has been proven once again during this particular war. So I think the China gets another window of opportunity here, even though China's role this time has been questioned by many at this time. You know, there are main countries that it has focused by while going all out is the Saudi Arabia, then Iran, Egypt, Oman, and UAE. They are the key fronts, and in many ways, if you come to think of it, it has knit some kind of a web of strategic partnerships, which is doing. But in this particular war, of course, it has a very big dilemma, and the dilemma is that Iran has been attacked, but Iran has attacked all its other partners in the GCC, and that is something very important. I think that if, for the time being, at least in the short to medium term, China's policy is to stay under the radar as well as be a part of the US plus one policy. It is also true that after this war is over, the equations among the regional countries will also not be the same. So therefore, it is quite possible as if Iran, let us say, if the war happens again the second time, which appears unlikely, in that case, the Iran has said that it will be attacking all the uh, installations of the Americans, including their the innovation, the science and technology, the IT companies, the AI companies, everybody. And they are all in a big way there because most of these countries are diversifying from the hydrocarbons. And at that time, if those countries, those companies, the big multinationals start leaving the region, then China might get into this defense, security, and innovation domain in a very big way. And we are witnessing it already. That just last week we had the Crown Prince of UAE visiting there today, yesterday morning. Uh, President Xi Jinping spoke to MBS, and Wang Yi has been there. But we have seen that while there have been very good statements, but more than the statements, we have not seen much overtly. But covertly, one has understood that they have sold one satellite to them, Iranians. It has provided the full intelligence. A lot of reports have been coming there. In fact, one of the ships that Americans caught was carrying some kind of equipment for the Iranians from and was going to Bandar Abbas. So I think that continues, like with Russia and with China. The both are working on in a very big way together to somehow keep Iran safe. Now that is also not being may not be looked very kindly afterwards by these countries, because if they presume and understand and think that China supported Iran in a big way. That's the reason that the Chinese have been asking for de-escalation like us. Besides, their policy in the region is also amenable to most countries, because most of these countries are run by some kind of either monarchies or autarchies, and therefore the China that following non-interference, non-prescriptive, non-value laden policies which suit them. And so therefore they are very much interested in doing that. This year they are also this will be the 10th anniversary, I think, of the Arab paper that was published in 2016, and the first visit of Xi Jinping to Tehran, Egypt, and Iran. And thereafter, he went again in 22, and we have seen that what happened to Biden after his visit, and how the Xi Jinping was received, and the three summits were held in the same place. So they operate on a very different level. As far as now, this particular war has also created a new dynamic. That is, more of these countries are now going to deal in the petro-yuan, including the Iranians who are asking their $2 million or $10 per barrel in yuan. Even Russians have said that whatever they're going to sell to the Europeans will be paid in yuan. So that is another thing that the Iranians, some people say that the Iranians wanted to drag China in, but Chinese would be rather happy in that context. It has also played Cupid, as we know, that between Saudi Arabia and Iran. 2023 agreement was very significant and consequential. Most of the countries supported it, and also between Algeria and Morocco, and brought about all the Palestinians actually groups together. But so far, as I said, they tried to play just 2 minutes. Yes, sir. But in this war, actually, some people say that China is playing a long game by remaining neutral. But it is also possible that it thinks that after the war, it will be able to pick up all the threats and bring them together, and could become a major player. So I think that China is a country which will remain very significant, and all its internal concerns, which would have come from Islamic world, like the Uyghur issue and others, have been put under the carpet. So one China policy is followed. So China's concerns are taken care of by all these countries, and they're going on a big way. There are a lot of projects that are continuing. So I'll stop here, sir.
Thank you very much, Anil. I appreciate it. We'll now turn to our next speaker, Jayadeva Ranade. Jayadeva is, to my mind, the foremost expert we have in our country on Tibet. He has been, watching this space for a very long time, and that is reflected in the chapter on Tibet, the Tibet Question, that he has written for our volume. Jayadev's chapter treats Tibet not as a frozen historical issue, but as an active, multi-dimensional pressure point through which China is systematically tightening the noose, so to say, around India, using military buildup, cultural erasure of Tibetan identity, control over the reincarnation process, water resource leverage, and the construction of a China-centric, what he calls Himalayan grouping. So now I'll invite Jayadev to share his thoughts with us on the Tibet question.
Thank you, Ashok, and thanks to the VIF for including me in this project, and to the ICS for hosting this webinar and inviting all of us to speak on selected chapters. You're quite right. I have looked at Tibet, and I still do, as something of a dynamic issue for us vis-a-vis China. Ever since the Chinese communists captured power in Beijing and moved in, they sort of took over Tibet. And since that date, if I may put it, our borders with China have been troubled. There are various reasons. I won't go into the border issue, but they have been disturbed. And part of it rests on the Chinese claim of Tibet as being an integral part of China, and the boundaries of old Tibet being incorporated by them in their map. So that is one aspect that we do have. And I'd just like to point out here that the problems between China and India uh, over Tibet started before the Dalai Lama arrived here. There is a narrative which has been around saying that since the Dalai Lama fled to India in 1959, relations between China and India have worsened. That is actually incorrect. And when we look at the way the border issue has been raised, the way the Chinese have tackled it, it becomes quite clear. But confining ourselves to the Tibet problem, there are two, three points I'd like to make here. Firstly, in some ways, the Chinese, while they have quelled the sporadic violence that used to erupt in Tibet off and on, they are conscious that there is a undying, if I may say, restiveness in that autonomous region. They're trying to quell it. Some years ago, they identified the monks and the clergy as the troublemakers, as they put it, quote unquote, in Tibet. And they began working on them to try and get them to adapt to socialism with Chinese characteristics, to get them to adapt Tibetan Buddhism to socialism with Chinese characteristics, etc., which includes amending their preachings and their teachings to the lay people. Here they co-opted, and that was a move done by them to co-opt their selection for the Panchen Lama into this effort. There have been signs that at times he has been a bit reluctant, or he has maybe not studied hard enough, as Xi Jinping put it, but he seems to have fallen in line now, at least since 1.5 years when Xi Jinping had a meeting with him. So that is, I think, a backdrop. The problem in Tibet is something that will keep surfacing for us, and it will bedevil our relationship with China. The other point I would like to make is that with the critical stage of the Dalai Lama himself and his health coming to the fore progressively, the issue is gaining some urgency. We have started seeing increased activity by the Chinese on the issue of selecting the reincarnation and of preparing the ground for the reincarnation. They have started reaching out to monks here, influential monks within India. They've started reaching out to the heads of the various sects. So far as I know, unsuccessfully, but efforts are underway. And they're trying to pave the way for their nominee for the next Dalai Lama to be selected. If they achieve that, they feel that they would be able to quell the problems in Tibet and win the Tibetans over to their side. However, if there is another Dalai Lama who is propped up by the Tibetans outside and endorsed by the Central Tibet administration and earlier, identified by the Dalai Lama as the likely choice, then this irritation or the problem will continue. And they will then look at it as in a different light. Already there are indications that they will point to support to this other Dalai Lama, not their choice, as interference in Chinese affairs, as things like this. And as far as we are concerned, the pressure will come on us to dismantle, if possible, or if that's the right word, the Central Tibet administration, to see that the religious lobby here, the next Dalai Lama's institution, is rendered, is neutralized. So that is the kind of scenario that we see. The fact that Tibet support groups now seem to be getting organized, and the Tibetan diaspora seems to be getting organized, indicates that they are planning also for the future. So I expect, as things stand today, well, it's difficult to say what's going to happen later, but as things stand today, that there will be friction points that will develop. They're already developing, and there will be some kind of a confrontation or friction of a serious nature that will take place between them. Here, I think I will mention at this stage that the United States seems to have taken a side and come out in support of the President Dalai Lama's choice for the reincarnation. So to that extent, the stage is set between Beijing and the United States. We are, of course, not saying anything for obvious reasons, but I think our stance would be pretty clear. The other point that I would like to make here is that we cannot look only at Tibet in isolation. There are two things that are happening of late that we need to take note of. One is the manner in which Chinese conduct of its foreign policy has undergone a slight change when we look just at Tibet. And that is reflected in their policy towards Nepal. After a long time of just watching from the sidelines or trying to influence from the sidelines, the Chinese began actually interfering in Nepalese politics until a few years ago, when they actually exercised dominant influence in Nepal. And probably, I would say, were able to nudge things in the direction that they wanted. In fact, one of their diplomats said to the Nepalese, as long as you have Lumbini, we'll be around, that kind of thing. And here again, Buddhism was the key source. So they have been applying pressure on Nepal through that. And recently, in fact, the Americans stepped up their game over the last few years. And from what I understand, during my visits to Nepal, the
1 minute,
the tide has somewhat changed, with the Americans now, as the Nepalese said, playing a predominant role. But the next point that I would like to make here, apart from this, that the Chinese methodology has changed, is that when we look at the future or what's going to happen, as I said, there will be pressure on us. Pressure will come. A lot will depend finally on the respective balance of power that we have between the two of us. And the issue will come down to Arunachal Pradesh, Ladakh, and a couple of other pockets. Obviously, we will resist it. But whether the Chinese will be willing to have some kind of a modus vivendi, etc., we will have to see. On our side, I think we should not be in a rush to have some kind of a arrangement, because it's a game of wait and see. I'll conclude and just make a couple of more closing comments. The Yarlung Sangpo and what is happening there, the dam, will be a very major issue. It's going to come up. They're already working on it. There are various reports that one comes across in the Chinese media about how they are going to go about it. That is something that is of concern to us and is a potential threat. It may not turn out to be, but it is from our point of view, we have to factor that in. The other is their effort to create a kind of Himalayan community around that. They picked up disparate countries, including Sri Lanka, to become part of that, which is surprising, but they are working on that kind of thing to apply pressure on us. So I don't see any making up, as if I may say, between the Chinese and us for some time to come. At present, what we see is a very tactical and tenuous arrangement, which I think will last maybe a year and a half or two, till the party congress is over and Xi Jinping comes back into the saddle, which I expect he will. So I think it's a Tibet for us is a dynamic issue, it's a sensitive issue, and it's something that will play a role in not only our relationship with China, but also with Nepal and Bangladesh, because the Chinese will use it wherever possible. So I'll just conclude here, but I'll say that it's a dynamic issue which we are watching. A lot of people are getting involved, and I agree with what I think you mentioned and Anil mentioned, that the Chinese are not down and out. I mean, their economy is in a bad shape. It's in a fairly bad shape. You can see the signs when you visit Beijing that the economy is not the same. If I may say, it's like a creaking cart now. But it's a big economy, and even if it's on the decline, it will take a long time. So I think, as far as we are concerned, we do have a powerful neighbor, economically and militarily, whom we face. We have demonstrated our ability to hold the line, as it were, with him in military terms. Uh, as far as the others are concerned, we'll have to see how the situation evolves. At the moment, China is under threat. And let me just conclude with one final point, which is that the Chinese narrative has started changing. It has started changing, reflecting the earlier concerns that they had. So today, you're after about 18 months, you've again found, or you again find, Chinese leaders and their statements talking about color revolution and also about Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, etc., being an integral part of China, something that they have not been saying for very long, but that has come back again. So that indicates a nervousness in the Chinese side. I don't think they consider us a big player, but I think they are looking at the US maybe meddling in the region. I'll end here, and I mean, I've strayed from the text itself, but I thought I'll, bring everyone up to date on what the text leads up to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jayadeva. You have indeed, brought us up to date on what's happening in Tibet and how it impacts us as a country. Now we move to a third panelist, Santosh Pai. Santosh is a practitioner, scholar. You know, uh, he focuses on the China space for his living, but he also, as a scholar, he looks very carefully on what's happening in China, in Taiwan. And if he's a frequent visitor to China and Taiwan, which gives him sort of a flavor of on the ground scene. He has contributed a chapter on impact of zero COVID policy on China. He has provided a forensic account of how the zero COVID policy, initially a political asset that allowed Xi to claim superiority over Western democracies, became an economic and diplomatic liability that inflicted lasting damage on China's domestic politics, economy, and external standing. So over to you, Santosh.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I think it's a great sign that we have a very large participation today to discuss this book. That's a testimony to the value of the book that was brought out last year and its continuing value to listeners. So, as Ambassador said, my chapter in the book was about zero COVID policy, at which time I was taking measure of what impact it's having on different facets of China, from society to economy, politics, and so on. But today, given the short time, I was forced to choose a couple of issues on which I will focus in 8 minutes or so. because I ended the chapter by saying a lot of structural constraints in China were sort of accelerated by zero COVID, and it's unclear what the solution will be in the long term. So I'll use that as a hook and build out into two areas. The first one is the question of domestic consumption. And initially, domestic consumption was sold in policy language as a balancing act, saying, we need dual circulation to work, and domestic consumption has to pick up to reduce reliance on external trade and so on. So it was sold as a balancing act, but today it's almost become existential. The second area I'll focus on is the increased focus on technology. If you look back, I didn't focus on that much on this topic in the zero COVID chapter, but today, if you look at what China is doing, the inflection point does seem to be zero COVID when this increased focus on technology started. So, on each of these aspects, I will explain maybe why China is doing this, given my vantage point, and how it is manifesting, because that's where the implications for India arise. So, starting with domestic consumption. So, to my mind, there are at least 3 to 4 reasons why domestic consumption has become extremely important after the zero COVID period. The first one is the rebalancing I referred to. I think the harshness of the zero COVID policy uh, uh, initiated a lot of policy making around the world to reduce dependence on China. So that still remains. Those efforts are now bearing fruit with the US and EU leading the charge with their own industrial policies to reduce dependence on China. And some developing countries like India also making efforts with not much success, but still the efforts are on. So this is one main reason. The second one is, I think, after zero COVID, the excess capacity within the Chinese industry, uh, which was then seen as a more or less temporary measure due to COVID, has continued to prolong. And this is particularly high in the low tech and medium tech industries, which is basically labor intensive industries where other developing countries have offered options for relocation of supply chains and so on. So in China today, a lot of domestic consumption measures are directed at these kind of low to medium tech industries, because a lot of Chinese companies have excess capacity, and if demand doesn't pick up, it will lead to unemployment, which will then lead to social strife and so on. So I think this is one more aspect why domestic consumption has remained relevant far beyond the zero COVID era. And thirdly, of course, the GDP. I think during zero COVID, the debate was how long it will take for China to regain the pace of growth. But today we are in 2026, and 4.5 or between 4.5 and 5% GDP is now almost normalized. There's no more discussion about going back to a higher level, but more about normalizing this slightly slower GDP growth rate. And third, I think, is the collapse of the real estate industry, which was also during zero COVID seen as a temporary phase, which will then pick up and so on. That has simply not happened. Real estate or construction industry as a whole in China is still not showing any signs of recovery. And this is one more reason why it's very, very urgent for the Chinese policymakers to trigger growth or spur domestic consumption in other areas. And now I come to the manifestations. I think one of the first measures during zero COVID to boost domestic consumption was the issuance of these coupons or discount coupons in Suzhou, if I remember correctly. Today, that has now become a national level experiment. It's no longer an experiment; it's a national trend. If you see successive annual budgets of China, increasing amounts of budgetary allocation has been given to similar schemes. It has been augmented by many more innovations, like trade-in of electronic appliances, building out the culture and the sports industry. At last count, I think at least 20 cities in China now have annual marathons to boost domestic travel and domestic consumption. Even neighborhood level, I recently found out that a neighborhood in Beijing has a incentive policy for relocating offices of multinational companies, which frankly was never done at such a local level. It was almost always at the city level or at the provincial level. So I think this has now become a constant trend of boosting domestic consumption. And it's very interesting to see the different experiments that are being done and what works and what doesn't work. Now I'll move on to the second the sort of category, which is technology. During zero COVID, we saw extensive use of drones for monitoring, surveillance, and so on. But it was not yet clear to what extent this use of technology will permeate throughout the industry. Today, in hindsight, it's far more clearer. If you look at the latest 5-year plan which China rolled out, it is completely built around technology. Across industry, I think there is a massive stimulus being given in form of tax incentives. In fact, I think in across the world, I think never has any country given a 200% exemption from tax for R&D expenses. And so that demonstrates, one of the ways where China is really upping the stake. And why is this so? I think there are three different reasons. One is the great power contestation with the US. So you can trace that back to 2016 and 17, when China had to stop talking about made in China and so on because of blowback. So that's one reason which this continues. China wants to eliminate dependence on choke points and develop frontier technology. The
Santosh,
second reason, yes, last 2 minutes. The second reason is to secure its own trade and FDI flows. I think China wants to maintain, no matter what it says, it wants to maintain its export dependency. And one way it can do that is to upgrade the technology so that other competitors don't have the same combination of price and function in some of its exports. The third reason, which is very domestic and very political, is that if your GDP is slowing down, you have to get something to show for it. What's the trade-off? So I think technology upgradation is now emerging as the most logical trade-off. So the Chinese public feels that yes, our GDP is slowing down, but at least we are getting higher in the technology ladder, and that's the cost we have to pay. So I think these are the three things I wanted to talk about. We can speak much more in the Q&A discussion. Thank you very much.
thank you, Santosh. Now we move to our fourth panelist, Ananth Krishnan. Ananth is one of our finalist journalists and commentators on China, and he has this advantage that he has been based in China for extended period, knows Chinese language, and he has really, a nuanced understanding of the country. So he had contributed this chapter on China after the 20th Party Congress, political, economic, and technological developments. This chapter had assessed Xi Jinping's third term against triple crisis of zero COVID that Santosh referred to, both zero COVID and protests that took place, structural economic slowdown, and intensifying the US-led technological blockade. And he has, concluded that the most consequential challenge she faces today is more than external pressure. It's, this pervasive sentiment of national stagnation or Nechuan, and threat to parties' social contract. So I will invite Ananth to make his presentation, and then we'll have discussion.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Ambassador Kantha. Thank you to ICS for this event, and also to you and VIF for the opportunity to contribute to this volume, which I hope will be read widely. So as you just mentioned, I wrote this chapter in around the time of early 2023, which was following the 20th Party Congress. And it was actually, looking back 3 years ago, it was a bit of a chaotic time in Beijing then, when they had just lifted overnight the zero COVID restrictions that Santosh spoke about. And you had this wave of deaths at a time when the rest of the world was coming to normalcy. So I thought I'll just very quickly speak about my main arguments in the chapter and update them as to where we are 3 years onward. So I was reporting from Beijing until about April 2023, and then I've been able to go back since January of this year. So it's been useful to kind of see over the past 2-3 years, the changed kind of perspectives on the ground as to where people think China is going. It seems like a long time ago, but 3 years ago, at the start of Xi's third term, he obviously had this very big political success at the party congress, where he did something Mao hadn't been able to do, which was pretty much fill up the top levels of the party with his own people, kind of a clean sweep. But at the same time, despite this, there was a sense that he was somewhat on the back foot then. I won't go too much into this, but just to kind of refresh your memories, at the end of 2022, again, seems like a long time ago, but you had this extraordinary situation where you were seeing protests across many Chinese cities, in Chinese college campuses. You had these white paper protests where people were pretty much expressing, venting their frustration at the restrictions they'd been living under when they saw. I remember this moment when people in Beijing were watching the Football World Cup in Qatar, and they were like shocked to see the rest of the world being back to normal while they were still having lockdowns and being locked up. So you had, even in Beijing, you had several hundred people come out and protest, and that led to an almost overnight withdrawal of the restrictions. So politically, it was a tough time, I think, for the party back then. I won't. Secondly, the second issue is on the economic front. I'm not going to repeat what Santosh said, but he's absolutely right, where both on account of COVID policies and other longer-term structural issues that the economy was facing, especially the real estate slowdown, there's a very sort of sense of depressed consumer sentiment, a very weak job market, and people really didn't have a sense of confidence about whether the country was growing and the direction in which the economy was heading. And thirdly, something maybe, again, I'll speak briefly. I'm sure we'll have more questions on China's external environment, which then was also very adverse. You were in the height of the US-China trade and technology war. You'd seen a sort of concerted effort by the US to limit access to some critical technologies. And there was great concern in Beijing about how this would hamper all these big tech plans that they have that Santosh also mentioned. Now, it's interesting to look back and see how they fared on all these three issues over the last 3 years. And I'll go into them very, very briefly since we have a limited amount of time. But I think to sum it up, politically, I think Xi has emerged in a stronger position. Economically, many of those problems still persist. I think strategically, the picture is a bit mixed, although I think you're beginning to see perhaps a slightly better situation for China, given especially that you've had this vacillating approach to China from Trump, very different from you had a more concerted approach you had from the Biden administration, where they were trying to make common cause with partners and allies, which is not happening now. And in fact, Trump is coming to Beijing in a couple of weeks' time, or scheduled to come to Beijing in a couple of weeks' time. Looking at these issues one by one, I think politically, with the caveat that none of us really know what's happening inside up to a point, given it's such a black box, I think that what's been interesting in the last 12 months is, even if the leadership came through this COVID challenge, you've been seeing significant military and political churn in the leadership. The most prominent of this has been the complete and extraordinary removal of most of the members of the Central Military Commission. You had the removal of the vice chairman, the first vice chairman, the top-ranking general Zhang Youxia, which came as a huge shock to everyone who's been following Chinese politics, given the assumption that he was very close to Xi. You had several other generals removed. and now you're at a point where the Central Military Commission is essentially just Xi Jinping and one other person. You've had, again, huge purges in the PLA rocket force. And again, it's been pretty unclear why these have been happening. Is it because of corruption? Is it because of loyalty? Is it because of concerns over problems and how operational and ready the PLA is? We really don't know. But obviously, what you can say by looking at it from the outside is clearly it's not exactly going as they had planned, because you wouldn't be having a wholesale removal of the leadership if that was the case. Secondly, on the economic side, I think I'll skip over some of this, given that I think Santosh has kind of summed it up. But I do think that being in Beijing at this moment, there's this strange sense where, on the one hand, there's so much optimism over all these improvements in technology that you're seeing, and the fact that people are paying attention and reading about Chinese exports of EVs and how Chinese technology is being appreciated abroad. But then, on the other hand, you have this strange kind of depressed sentiment about their own kind of prospects, about jobs, about real estate, which is a huge. I think sometimes you don't appreciate how it's such a big psychological impact, because for most people it's their net worth and it's their savings. Unlike here, you don't really have people who put their money in FDs and other financial instruments because they yield such low returns in China. But you've just been watching over 12 to 18 months your savings being eroded, and in some places completely being evaporated. So obviously there's a huge downstream economic impact to that. You've seen some stabilization in housing prices in Beijing and Shanghai, but where most Chinese live, in tier 2, 3, 4 cities, it's a very depressing situation where you have homes that are unsellable, and you have a glut of unfinished projects as well that you really see when you're traveling in these places. So you have this very strange dichotomy, which Santosh also referenced, where on the one hand, you have these achievements that people are rightfully proud about, and you can see in their lived experience. They can see the cars on Chinese streets, they can see EV penetration, they can see lives being more livable. But on the other hand, you do have very serious economic problems. I think I'll just say very briefly on self-reliance, since I don't want to repeat again what the previous speaker said. I think that's been the key focus since the 20th Party Congress, from everything that they've put out, including in the current 5-year plan. And I think it was summed up quite with some clarity in an article that Xi Jinping wrote in Choshe, which was basically the sense of making China less reliant on the world and making the world more reliant on China and Chinese supply chains. And I think they have a sense that they have achieved some of that, although there are vulnerabilities such as chips. And we have to see how they're going to deal with that. And a final point, I think, just some thoughts on the external environment. Maybe we can speak about that. I think despite the Iran crisis and China's energy concerns, there does seem to be a sense in Beijing that things are brighter than they were a few years ago. At least if you look at the stream of foreign guests that they've been getting from Europe, the fact that they've been looking to stabilize relations with much of their neighbors, perhaps except for Japan, the fact that they've been working towards Trump coming in mid-May, which seems to be the focus in this moment. So it will be interesting to see how that visit, if it goes ahead, if it plays out. But I think that's one kind of bright spot that they'll be looking at. I think I'll stop there now, Ambassador Kantha, and maybe we can go deeper into some of these themes.
Thank you, Ananth. In fact, what I'll do, I will pose one question to each of the panelists, and we'll go in the reverse order. So, Ananth, will start with you. And in fact, we'll start where you just left off, the external dimension. But I have a two-barrel, question for you. One, is it accurate to say that there has been a marked shift in China's, mood or its level of confidence since one can say sometime last year, when they think that they managed to stare down Trump. in the tariff war. And as you mentioned, Trump's policy, strategic stance towards China has undergone a very significant shift compared to his first term. And this procession of European leaders and others coming to Beijing. So, in a way, they are in a better place strategically. Then I moved to India. India, if you look at comments made by Chinese scholars, they are persuaded that we are in a rough spot. We are in a difficult spot because lack of traction in our strategic engagement with USA, and in a way, it's a loss of squeezing of strategic space of India. How do they look at India as a player, kind of important salience they need to give to India when they feel they are in ascendance? And that came across also during Iran war. China was seen as one of the sort of winners of in the Iran war, and India being in a difficult spot. So these two things, your comments based on your conversations in Beijing and the fact that you have been based there for a long time and now you are back in Beijing since January this year.
No, thank you. I would agree with you broadly in the sense that I see there's a much less of the anxiety that you felt during Trump 1.0 and during the Biden administration, where it seemed that there was this agreed US policy that they were going to work with countries and have a very thought out, considered approach to restrict China's access to technology and pretty much halt China's growth in areas in critical sectors. And I think there was real anxiety that could happen. And I think, as you said, a lot of that seems to have evaporated during the current Trump administration. Whether or not, I mean, just reading what is being put out in the Chinese official media, I'm sure, of course, I'll caveat this by saying there's serious concerns over what's happening in Iran. On some level, there's acknowledgement of US military might in the way they did what they did in Venezuela, and of course the demonstration of US military power. But on the other hand, they do also see this kind of narrative gift that they've been given, which is to the way portray themselves as a very, very different power to what Trump's America is. And the way that they've reached out to Europe, the way that they've tried to mend fences with some countries in the region. So I do agree with you broadly that I think they feel they are in a better place strategically. But on the other hand, I do think there are other concerns, for example, that which they probably should heed, which is fears of this China shock 2.0, the fact that if you look at latest trade figures, that countries are extremely anxious about this flood of Chinese goods that are coming, and they don't really feel Beijing is paying attention to that or addressing their concerns, including some of their own close partners in the region, which is something that I think is going to become a very acute issue going forward. On India, it's been interesting to see this, how it's kind of waxed and waned, where there seemed to be, I think a few months ago, this kind of urgency from China, which you saw in engagement of pushing this normalization. But for whatever reason, you do see less of it now. Either is it because that is it because that the normalization has been so stop-start and difficult, where it took so long, it took more than a year to even do some of the simpler low-hanging fruit, which is relaxing visas for tourists and resuming flights. On journalists, they still actually yet to come to a proper agreement. So I don't know if it's because this normalization has been so stop-start and really hasn't made headway, or if it's because, as you put it, that perhaps they look at India's position in the world differently. It does seem that while they are saying what they've been saying for the last 18 months, which is they want to normalize with India, et cetera, it doesn't seem to be panning out that way.
Thank you, Ananth. I'll now move to Santosh. Santosh, both in your chapter in the book and presentation you made just now, you have brought out a set of legacy problems China is facing in its economy. And in some way, these problems are both structural and mutually reinforcing. Uh, Xi Jinping's response seems to be doubling down on manufacturing and exports rather than, while domestic demand is being given importance, but somehow it's not picking up. As Ananth brought out, China Shock 2.0 is a real problem, and it's going to become even more acute challenge. Because a large economy like China cannot possibly export its way out of its economic predicament. So how do you look at uh, say next decade for Chinese economy? Do you expect just gradually, gently shifting into a lower growth trajectory as IMF had just projected? They're given figures up to 2031, and the last 3-4 years of that period, a growth rate will be around 3% or thereabouts. Or is it heading towards Japan style lost decade? Or whether it has enough residual dynamism to escape that fate? Your thoughts on that?
Thank you, Ambassador. I think there are two aspects to this issue. One is the domestic control levers which Beijing has, and one is the external factor. Now, on the external factor, I think partly China is benefiting from the fact that other economies are finding it extremely difficult to localize manufacturing of some of these products on which they rely on China. So that is giving them a longer runway to deal with this issue, because exports from China haven't receded. China's share of manufacturing output hasn't receded. What has changed in the last 2-3 years is the routing of the exports, the transshipment, and so on. So this is the external environment. Domestically, I think they are preparing for a slower growth rate. I don't think it will reach Japan levels of slowdown, simply because I think the population is relatively speaking younger, and the modernization and the technology upgradation will give them some kind of a efficiency from a productivity factor perspective. So instead of requiring more labor, they will require less labor to churn out the same things. And they will deploy this excess labor into newer areas where China wants to build dominance from scratch, which is in the future industries, what they call, or the new productive forces, and so on. And simultaneously, the domestic service economy, which people don't observe too much because it's extremely difficult to get hold of figures, because the service sector in China has forever been a controversial topic from a definitional perspective, because they tend to include transport and so on into service industry. But right now, most of the heavy government-led demand in the service industry has already plateaued, which is construction of high-speed railways and so on. So now they are constantly trying to figure out new ways of service sector domestic consumption. So I think for these reasons, they have a slightly more headroom to continue in this 4.5 to 5% bracket. But the composition will definitely undergo a churn. So that's how I look at it. And the only thing that can change here is if the external environment is able to get its game together. If many more countries reduce dependency on China faster, then I think it will be a major crisis, because they don't have a substitute for that export dependency yet. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now move to Jayadeva Ranade. And Jayadeva, what I'll do, I'll relate to you one question posed by Ambassador Vijay Nambiar in the chat box. He has inquired how steady and stable do you assess the US position under Trump on, the Dalai Lama succession issue and on the overall question of Tibet? Is there likely to be an erosion of their support? And I'll add, one supplementary question. What do you think should be our position on the succession issue? Because this is something which affects us quite materially. Chinese are talking about controlling succession not only of the 14th Dalai Lama, but across the board of all Tunku Lamas. Jayadeva, what's your response?
Thank you, Ashok. As far as Ambassador Namia's question is concerned, the United States is a superpower, is a global superpower for the present. And I think they will stick with not taking an explicit position, but continuing their present state of ambiguity on this issue. So far, the Congress has passed various resolutions, and the administration has basically supported them, backed them, without making an explicit kind of comment. But having said that, let me say that what we need to keep in mind, I think, is that Trump, whereas initially under that Doge move, they had scrapped a whole lot of assistance to various people, including the Tibetans. But that, after a gap, was restored. So I think to that extent, Trump understands the importance of the Tibet issue for the United States from a strategic perspective. And my view is that he will continue to support it. To what extent, we will have to wait and see. I don't think it will become a very, it won't lead to a confrontation, but certainly it will be one of the sticking points. And the Chinese, from what I can sense and see, will raise it in case this meeting in mid-May takes place. So they will raise it with Trump. We'll get an idea, but I think it will be skirted. It will remain an issue. And as far as the erosion of the support, I think the crucial will be the manner in which the Tibet support groups based in the West, how they take up the entire issue. And they now seem to be mobilizing. So let us see whether they do it in time. But I don't anticipate a dilution of support for the Tibet cause as such. There are many players in the United States who will be backing it. And I think Trump himself may not be inclined either for or against. So he will continue with it. For him, that will be the line of least resistance. That is what I feel. As far as we are concerned, I think we are doing, we are not sort of revealing our cards officially. But when it comes to it, I think we will have to take into interest, of course, our national interest. And my suggestion would be, or my recommendation would be, that we support whatever the Tibetan diaspora goes with, or whatever the Tibetans go with, rather, not diaspora, the Tibetans. And obviously, we don't know how the Tibetans inside Tibet feel. So it will have to be what the Tibetan diaspora goes with. That is important for us for two reasons. One, of course, we are independent, we show it. Second, for us, we have Tibetans living in our country. So it's best to pander to, or look after their interests also. And thirdly, it will have repercussions on how the rest of the world views us. And I think that's a factor we need to keep in mind. So my suggestion would be, or my recommendation would be, that we back whatever decision the Tibetans outside Tibet take. Outside Tibet means not in the PRC either. Thank you.
Thank you. I now turn to Anil Trigunayat. Anil, in your chapter, you have argued that China was building a US plus one role for itself in West Asia. Now we have seen Iran war and China's relatively measured, low-key role, where in fact it has even refrained from outright strident denunciation of US military attack on Iran. It's calling for ceasefire, supporting Pakistan as an intermediary, but doing so from behind the scene, providing economic lifeline to Iran through oil purchases, but not challenging US blockade in any way. And most importantly, in no way, positioning itself as a replacement for USA as a security guarantor. Looking at these developments, uh, how do you sort of revisit your thesis of China being on a solid trajectory towards attaining US plus one status in West Asia?
So I think that this particular dimension of its outreach or engagement in the region will continue uh, because nobody has questioned exactly how China is playing out. Right now, they are making all right noises. They're calling out the Americans, but they are also waiting for this visit to happen because for them, the US president's visit is also quite important in many ways, as has been mentioned by others also. As far as their intrinsic engagement, and that's precisely the reason, in my view, that they had this dilemma exactly. They were not very happy when Iran started attacking all the assets, including infrastructure in Gulf countries. And they somehow they have been playing a very, as you rightly mentioned, a measured response to this, but providing, I mean, what one gathers from other places are significant intelligence, basically, and whatever parts were required or support is required from time to time, including very recently as well. They have a special envoy, Jaizun, and I think he was there on March 23, about nearly a month after that. And he did not, he met all the Arabs generally, but he did not meet the Iranians and the Israelis while he was visiting. He met their ambassadors in Beijing. So China is playing this middle path at the moment, ironically, trying to have good relations with everyone. But since it is the major importer of oil from the region, about 40% of the total oil China buys. So, and they are now shifting into the yuan also within the BRICS context. Now they're talking about the BRICS pay system or something coming up. The AIIB, they are getting strongly engaged. So I think that China once again will get its heft and will continue to do so. Because we cannot, in my view, and you know China better, that it can go full stream or throttle once the war ends. No doubt at the moment from outside, for us, it looks as if China has not done enough, but China also is supporting Pakistan. The Pakistani minister was there just after that. So Chinese spoke to Iranians, so did the Russians, asking them to come on this table, basically getting into the first round on April 11th happened with the intervention of China and Russia both simultaneously, as the Americans have been asking them to do. Americans also asked the Chinese, and today they have refused to provide any military assistance or naval facilitation for against Iran to the Americans very clearly. So they are maintaining this, but as I said, that they will not like to take on the role of security provider. But if they are going to get so well embedded economically or geo-economically, like they have done so many ports and all that they are doing, they are planning to have other bases. So in that case, eventually, it'll like to emerge as a provider. Naturally, there are questions in the minds of the Gulf countries, especially, that they cannot trust the Americans anymore. Now, where do they go? I mean, which is their own security architecture, and from external influence, it is only can be from US or from Russia or from China.
Thanks. Now we take questions from the chat box. In fact, there are quite a few questions. I'll start with a question from Dr. Kalyani Yola, and the question is directed to Jaydev. You mentioned that Tibet is still a source of friction. So why does it remain relatively muted in India's official foreign policy? Is that a strategic restraint, or it's because of lack of leverage? Jaydev?
Yeah, well, I suppose one could call it strategic restraint, but it is a source of friction, no doubt. Whether the strategic restraint is justified the way it has been practiced is another matter. But it does, to that extent, limit our leverage. And I point to the birthday celebrations. I think they were the birthday celebrations of the Dalai Lama planned in Delhi, which at the last moment we pulled the plug and we cancelled it. I think it was a social event being planned inside Delhi, and we should have gone ahead with it. At the most, the Chinese would have made a protest. Well, that's fine. Our commitment was that there'd be no political activity. So I think by doing this, we have, to some extent, diluted the leverage that we have. I mean, it's another matter whether we ever exercise it or not, but it is something that we did have. And I think with China, we do need whatever leverages we can for negotiations in future.
Thank you. Now I'll take a question from Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. He has not posed it to anyone particular, but I'll request Ananth to respond to this question. Basically, Manu is asking, do we have any sense of debates that is taking place within the leadership on a whole lot of issues that we discussed, political, military, economic issues. So Ananth would like to stick your neck out and comment on that.
I will give my 2 cents on that, but I don't want to give the misimpression that I have a year to what the leadership is discussing or debating. And it's only from what you see in the press and what you see from think tanks and scholars. Sadly, I think the kind of access that people have, at least in the time that I've been in China from 2008-9 to now, I think Ambassador Kantha, you'd remember those times as well. I think post 2012, 13, 14, you really, you're so far removed. Even those little sort of inklings that you would get in the past over debates that were happening no longer come out. It's such a tightly run ship. But I think that if you do follow what's being said in state media, I'm not exactly sure whether Professor Mohanty was referring to the economic issues we were speaking about or the strategic issues that we were speaking about. I'm not entirely sure. But I think it is very clear that it's a China today where they're very clear how they approach certain issues and everyone falls in line. It's not a China where you're having different points of view come out and you see a debate playing out publicly. So it's my long-winded way of saying we don't really quite know what's being debated internally among the leadership. There's one thing I wanted to add on Tibet, if I may.
Yes, please. Yeah.
I do think that it is. I agree with what Mr. Ranade was saying.
Ananth, I'll just relay a question that Nanima Basu has posed in chat box. Essentially, she's inquiring, what stance India should take. Jayadeva has responded to that on reincarnation issue, and she has mentioned that Tibetans living in India expect India to take a decisive role on this issue rather than dealing with it as a religious issue. So I would like to have your comments on that also.
No, I do think that this, I potentially see this as becoming a really significant friction point, only because I think that over time you've seen a gradual sort of hardening and increasing of Chinese expectations on India's actions, where in the past, I think there was an acceptance that India was in a unique position, given that the Dalai Lama has been a guest, and there was a cognizance of India's official policy that he's a honored, revered spiritual leader who's a guest of India. But I think what's been interesting to see over the last decade or so has been a change in Chinese expectations, where the threshold for what they thought in the past was normal for something to happen in India, that's beginning to change. So I think going forward, I do see that becoming a friction point. Again, we aren't really quite sure how India would deal with this, but I would be very surprised if there was a change in India's approach, which is to consider the Dalai Lama and future Dalai Lamas chosen by Tibetans living in India as honored guests of India. And I think it'd be very surprising to see a deviation from that, which is why I think it will be interesting to see how this becomes a source of friction given Beijing's changing expectations.
Thank you. We are running out of time. So last question we'll take is from Mr. Ravi Bhutlingam, and this is for Santosh. Ravi is inquiring, given India's stagnant net inward FDI, actually it was negative, it has been negative in last few months, and sluggish domestic investment. Indian industry has flagged the need for Chinese investment, especially in green energy, mobility, machine tools, and electronics. Are recent policy revisions targeted enough to attract what we need, or are they mere tweaks that may not move the needle much? Santosh?
Yes. Thank you, Ravi. I was actually planning to send a report from my recent trip to China, where I spent more than 2 weeks in 9 cities, with exactly grappling with this question. But I'll give a short summary now. I think there are 2 points here. One is the capital inflows that were blocked by India in the last 6 years, in one sense, were not very effective, because in that same period, the footprint of Chinese industry in India expanded very fast, very rapidly, using many other modalities which do not include capital flows. So the whole value of that Press Note 3 restriction was circumvented by many other models which continue to hold place, and they're actually more convenient because Chinese companies don't actually have to invest in India. The second part of this answer is that apart from the formal policy restriction of Press Note 3, India took a number of other actions, which were in the less formal way. It was investigation, enforcement actions, denial of visas, and so on. So until all those measures are addressed, the perception of India as an investment destination within Chinese industry has suffered immensely. And till that is repaired, I don't see a uptick in interest within Chinese industry to invest in India. Now, how much of that perception will be rectified will depend on whether India wants to get all this together and address the real concerns. We are having a new ambassador taking charge in a couple of weeks. So there is expectation that if that reset has to happen in outreach to Chinese industry and giving them confidence about India as an investment destination, some of these issues might be resolved. But so far, the simple answer is no. I think Press Note 3 relaxation alone is not sufficient to move the needle, as Ravi put it. Thank you.
Santosh, quick answer to a question Nazar Khan has in the chat box. This is about future of petrodollar. Essentially, is yuan going to make a dent as far as a formidable role of petrodollar is concerned?
No, I don't think so. I think China itself has not, has moderated its ambitions on, RMB internationalization and so on. I think opportunistically, yes, they will look for opportunities, but as a project or a long-term initiative, I don't see much firepower from China being devoted to this question, because they're doubling down on technology upgradation and so many other things. So even BRI for that, in that sense, has been moderated a little bit. So I would say the same applies here. I don't think it's very high on list of priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we are reaching the outer limit of the time provided to us, 90 minutes. So I shall not, stretch it any further. Will any of the panelists like to have the last word? If not, I'll also, take a pass there and request colleagues from ICS to take over for final comments.
Thank you, Ambassador Kantha. I now seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Good session. Thank you very much.
Very good discussions. Yeah.
With this, we come to an end of today's book discussion. We thank our panelists, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, Mr. Jayadeva Ranade, Mr. Santosh Pai, and Mr. Ananth Krishnan, as well as our moderator, Ambassador Ashok K, Kantha, for gracing today's book discussion with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS YouTube channel. We extend a warm invitation to all for the upcoming special panel discussion titled Archives and Their Significance in the Study of Foreign Policy or IR, the Contributions of A.S. Bhasin, scheduled for 29 April 2026 at 3 p.m. IST. Further details about the event can be found on the ICS website. You can subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.